first to the COVID-19 evolving crisis and the question we still haven't settled 6 months into it. How do you get the balance between caring for our economy and caring for the sick and the elderly? Joining me now is somebody who's written about this since the start with great clarity and a great sense that those two things have to be balanced. Jennifer Hewett from the Australian Financial Review. Welcome, Jennifer, to Watercooler.
Hello.
Jen, just before we get on to the substance of this interview, I know you've just flown in, or last night flew in from Victoria to New South Wales. Tell me what that's like, arriving at New South Wales from Victoria right now.
Well, that's right. I certainly felt like a refugee and perhaps a potential criminal when I arrived. People were incredibly nice with all the police, but there were an enormous number of police officers around. We went to the international terminal rather than the domestic terminal, and we had to wait in line, quite a lot, and fill in many forms, get repeatedly, have to give our proof of our identity, because of course if you're not a returning New South Wales resident, then you're just not allowed in. And all of that lasts for about an hour or so, and then you're put on a bus, no idea where you're going, and we turned up in the Sydney suburb at a perfectly nice hotel where there were many military Australian Defence Force people to escort you to your room, and of course I will be here now for 2 weeks without being able to open the door.
You have to pinch yourself, don't you? This is actually Australia. I mean, it sounds like exactly the experience I certainly had as a journalist travelling in communist countries, and you probably did too.
Yes, that's right. It did feel as if I was in either a very repressive society, or even a very kind of mild version of a war zone with all these uniformed figures around you escorting you at any time, and you knew that if you attempted to step out of line, there would be terrible consequences.
Now, Jennifer, you've been writing in the Fin Review multiple times a week. I'm always impressed by that, by the way. I struggle to do one column a week. But you've been writing since the start of this, more than 6 months ago, since the lockdown started, about the need to have a balanced response to make sure that the cure, if you will, is not worse than the disease. We haven't even begun to learn that lesson yet, have we? Certainly not in Victoria.
Well, certainly not in Victoria. I think that's always been reasonably front of mind, and of course increasingly so for the federal government, and that's why what's happened in Victoria is such a concern. Of course, it was all reasonably easy to try and balance the things, although with some difficulty, of course, in terms of getting the economy revived. But you saw when restrictions began to ease in most of the country, late May and June, the economy certainly wasn't anything like it had been before, but there were signs of life. Now, those signs of life have been pretty well extinguished in Victoria, as the government has decided that the only way to combat the virus was to have an incredibly protracted and very harsh lockdown. Of course, this was the state that had the harshest lockdown to start, but because of its own errors, it has meant that the whole of Victoria has been really just in a deep freeze for months. I think Victoria, without doubt, would have the longest and harshest shutdown of any country I can think of in the world.
Yeah, that's a point I think was made in the splash in your paper on Monday, that there's an Oxford Stringency Index, I think it's called Stringency Index, which measures how tough these lockdowns, and Victoria seems to be top of the tree, and yet relatively small number of cases compared to, say, Europe, America, just about anywhere else.
Yes, a very small number of cases, and of course many of the infections, most of the infections are actually concentrated in the aged care area, and also among hospital or health workers. But the rest of the economy is still being forced to just really undergo the most extreme conditions. And I think one of the issues this week was when it became apparent that the Victorian government had no plans for easing this off anytime soon. In fact, quite the reverse. It deepened and lengthened the length that most businesses and most people, of course, would be under the most, very, very tough restrictions. And this is what has sent, I think, the business community just spare the idea that there doesn't seem to be any attempt to balance the need to keep the economy alive while keeping people alive.
And look, we shouldn't pretend that's easy. I mean, the trade-off between public health and the economy has been very difficult from the start. But I think what troubled me, and you brought this up in your column on Monday, that certainly from Daniel Andrews' rhetoric, he doesn't seem to have even recognised that there needs to be a trade-off, yet let alone begun to wrestle with it.
No, I think his view is, oh, you've absolutely got to get this, the health crisis under control, and basically the economy can just wait until that's done. Well, there are two problems with that, I think. One is, of course, many businesses cannot wait. I mean, a lot of retail, a lot of hospitality and accommodation cannot now open until there are zero cases, for 2 weeks, by the end of November. I mean, many of them will there's no possibility of them being able to survive that. But the other huge issue in Victoria is that, unlike New South Wales, Victoria's contact tracing system has been notoriously terrible. I saw somebody, a federal official, comparing New South Wales and Victoria's systems to a Ferrari and a Trabant, and I think that is unfortunately true. And therefore, not only do you have these very, very, very tough thresholds to be met, which really are not being met anywhere in the world again, but you do not have any confidence in a system that can deliver it, because Victoria's contact tracing system, although it has definitely improved in the last few months, is still regarded as the worst in the country.
Some might say the reference to the Trabant is somewhat apt, given that that was the legacy of communist East Germany, while the West was getting on and developing the BMW and the Audi. They came up with the Trabant. But there is this, it's not, try and tread carefully here, but there is a kind of top-down socialist approach that comes from the Andrews government, which is not very helpful in these circumstances, I think.
Well, he dominates the government, clearly, and of course he has this habit of having a daily press conference, which he answers, which he says he answers every question. In fact, he takes questions, but he does not answer them. Often he says he'll get back to people and then never does. But I think more than that, it's the gap between his very, very tough rhetoric and the actual situation on the ground in terms of the efficiency and efficacy of the response, and nowhere, of course, more obvious than in the problems they have had with contact tracing. And that means really that if you've got cases in the community, it becomes so much harder to try and get a quick grip on that and to control those numbers and to send people into quarantine. This has been the issue from the beginning when cases were very low, and it remains the issue now, even when cases are, of course, are falling, into the around the 50s to 60s or even 40s relative to the hundreds. So the government's excuse, and Daniel Andrews' excuse, is that this is all because of the much higher numbers. Well, naturally that does complicate things, but this was a problem that was apparent from the beginning and is still apparent now.
Jenny, can you give us some insights from what you're picking up by talking to people in the business community, individual businesses, large and small? What's the picture you're getting of what's happening to our economy right now?
Well, in Victoria, it's just a shocking picture, and that, of course, has an effect on the rest of the economy. I think so. You almost have to kind of divide it into two countries again. There's Victoria and there's the rest. I mean, everyone else is having problems, of course, although the federal government's assistance has greatly helped reduce the impact of that for many people's lives. But in Victoria, all businesses, they're under these stage 4 restrictions, they have just been shut down. And not only that, I think there's a real feeling that the Andrews government has very little interest in their welfare or in consultations. You saw this this week with the government saying, oh yes, of course we had extensive consultations with the business community, and the business community basically saying, you've got to be kidding, this was really just a bad joke. There was no real consultation. There were one-way discussions, often with quite junior officials who read from a list and said, that was that and nothing more. So I do think that the economic cost of this is massive, and it has yet to be understood. And you had even, normally very mild-mannered types like the head of Wesfarmers, Rob Scott, putting out a very, very angry statement on Sunday when the details of the Premier's so-called plan or roadmap to recovery became clear. And you had Innes Willicks from the Australian Industry Group saying it was just a document of despair.
Yeah. I mean, you and I would have thought back in late March when all this, the intense lockdowns began, we would have thought that by now we would have been well on our way to mapping out a program for recovery from this. But it seems to me, it's frustrating that we can't begin to do that, because until we stop hitting the economy with a hammer, you don't know what the damage is or, what the task is ahead of you, do you?
Well, I think, interestingly, by late May and June, there was far more confidence. Of course, there was a total exaggeration right at the beginning about the number of likely cases and deaths in Australia. And this did lead, but in fact, because we were able to greatly reduce the number of international travellers, was very effective in limiting the spread of the virus. The one big exception was, of course, Victoria. And so the optimism of late May and early June has now been completely hammered by what's happened in Victoria. And of course, that has a huge impact across the country. And that's one of the reasons why so many of the other states refuse to have open borders, for example. It's obviously really dented business confidence, and it has totally confused now the ability of the federal government to try and figure out what it's got to do. Josh Frydenberg's got a budget coming up on October 6th. And, it's very obvious that they had not taken into account not only the impact of the Victorian shutdown, but the fact it would now continue so long in such a harsh way.
Well, Jennifer, what are you, day one of lockdown, day one of quarantine, having returned to New South Wales? I think that means you'll be able to concentrate on your columns fully. And
well, I guess there's not going to be much else to do.
Well, we look forward to more of your insights daily in the Australian Financial Review, which for my money...
When I finally do get out of quarantine, it'll be very interesting, I think, having not been in New South Wales for a couple of months, to see the difference between New South Wales and Victoria, and in particular the CBD area. Of course, Melbourne, not having the harbour and much else, really prides itself on its vibrant CBD. And of course, it's now a ghost town. That will take years, if ever, to recover from.
Yeah, it's tragic. But look, I look forward in a fortnight's time to welcoming you out for possibly a drink on the pavement in the free world.
Thanks, Nick.
Thank you, Jennifer.